Hello and welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman Live. It is Monday, May 6th, 2024. I'm Julie Hartman, back in the studio in Los Angeles instead of all the heck back east, all the way back there in New York. I was in New York, as some of you may know. Last week, I was at Columbia University for a few days, filming all of the crazy anti-Semites congregating in and around Columbia. I was also on Bill O'Reilly's show. I guest hosted Dennis Prager's show last week, and I'm so happy to be back in the beautiful, sunny, and subwayless Los Angeles, California. So it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's great to see Sean McConnell again. Hello, Seanzy. Missed you very much.
Hello, Julie, and promise me right now that you're never going to ride the subway alone again.
Oh my gosh, don't worry. That was already decided upon when I got off of the subway. Those of you who did not hear my subway story of last week, I encourage you to go look at those episodes of Timeless, because I was on the subway maybe for, 30 minutes in total for my entire trip. And I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, oh, LA girl goes to New York and gets on the subway and she's so terrified. Boo-hoo. Yes, you're damn right. LA girl goes to New York and gets on the subway and she's terrified. And you would be terrified too if you are not living in New York and you went on the subway. It has gotten so bad. Someone should go on for a day with a bulletproof vest and like the appropriate defense gear and write just a chronicle of 12 hours on a random day on the New York City subway. That will get many people to stop voting Democrat.
You know how I know it's bad?
Yeah.
New Yorkers say it's bad.
That's right. It's really gotten so much worse. But you know what? Kind of just adds to my life story, right? Makes me tougher, makes me better. I survived, but that's just to say, very happy to be home. 844-861-5537, 844-861-5537 is the call-in number, and as always, you can use the chat. Good afternoon to you too, AP Unfiltered. Hello to the other individuals writing in the chat. Great to be with you. And you know the rule, just keep it classy. But Timeless with Julie Hartman live chatters always keep it classy, at least so far they have. We are discussing a lot today, as usual. Katie Britt's book is coming out tomorrow. This infamous book that, with regard to the whole dog shooting saga, which we'll be discussing a little bit. It's interesting. Those of you listening can't see Sean's reaction. He just looked very perplexed. You have not heard about the dog shooting saga?
No, but that's Kristi Noem, right? Not Katie Britt?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I say Katie Britt? I meant Kristi Noem. Thank you. I'm sorry. I get my K first names, Republicans, mixed up. Thank you for clarifying. Yes, that's Kristi Noem. Her book is coming out tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit about the dog shooting saga, because since I've been gone, that has been one of the news stories that has percolated. And I think it's quite significant, actually, for us to discuss that and the reaction to it. And then the main bulk of today, I also really want to talk about this Antisemitism Awareness Act that was passed in the U.S. House of Representatives last week, and then it's heading over to the U.S. Senate for a vote. A lot of people who are pro-Israel and who are pro-protecting Jewish students are very in favor of this act, understandably so. However, I think it's very important that we really understand what this act is doing, because in fact, it is contributing, in my view at least, to this whole DEI complex, which is a lot of the problem that we are seeing now with the explosion of anti-Semitism and other things on college campuses and elsewhere. And so I actually think we need to be getting away from acts like these. So we'll be discussing that. Yes, someone is already writing, I'm pro-Israel and not for the bill. Yep. Agreed with you there. But just some quick housekeeping things before we dive in. I mentioned this on the show before, but I'd like to remind you that right now I am reading this book. It's called The Defining Decade: Why Your 20s Matter and How to Make the Most of Them Now. It's by Meg Jay. This book is actually about 10 to 15 years old, I think. It's quite an oldie book. I remember my older sister, who's 33, was gifted it when she was graduating from college. But as many of you know, I'm 24 years old. I'm trying to do my 20s right now, looking at Gen Z. It's really scary to see all of the data that is coming out with regard to things that my generation believes about America, about Israel, about patriotism, about gender. And so I just kind of want to consult what some people have said about this very important decade and see what I may be able to learn from it and what others may be able to learn from it. I'm almost done with the book. I'm about 70% of the way through. It's really good. So we'll be discussing that later this week if you want to tune in and if you want to read it with me. They have there are 3 sections of the book that we'll be talking about. There's the work section, there's the love section, and then there's a section called the brain and the body. And it's very relevant for 20-something-year-olds, obviously, but I think it's quite relevant for everybody. Just some timeless truths, for lack of a better term, in that book. So that's housekeeping thing number 1. Housekeeping thing number 2 is I want you to look out for a video that I will be posting in the near future. And it actually, I think, is going to be one of the most important videos I will ever do on this show, which is a big hype up, obviously. And it's about why I am voting for Donald Trump in November. Speaking of being in your 20s and speaking of Gen Z, there are a lot of people in my generation who are, yes, of course, there are many who are radical, but I think there are many who are in this moment coming around to seeing that our country is heading in a really, really, really bad direction. I've got to say, there's a part of me that goes, how the heck didn't you see this sooner? This has been percolating for some time now, all of this radicalism. But I think there's a real opportunity here where more and more Americans, including in my age bracket, are starting to see how bad the radical left has been and what they have done to our country. And I really want to seize on that moment and on that opportunity and talk about why I am proudly voting for Donald Trump in November. Does that mean that I support every single thing that he says or does? No, of course not. Does it mean that I don't have some very serious concerns or issues with some of the things that he has said and done? No, of course not. Of course I do. But this really, I believe so firmly, is the choice that we have to make right now. At the risk of sounding completely dramatic, I really believe that the future, the health, the survival of our country depends on this, and the future and the health and survival of our civilization depends on this. So please do check out that video and send it to somebody who would probably shudder at the thought of voting for Donald Trump, but I think they'll like that. All right, so Kristi Noem, not to be confused with Katie Britt. Kristi Noem. Since we've been gone, or since I have been away from this studio, there was this news story that came out that Kristi Noem, who is the governor of South Dakota, shot her dog. And I'm so sorry to laugh about this because there's nothing funny about shooting an animal. But I can't help but laugh because there's just a part of me that wants to yell out, conservatives, can we just be normal? Like, please, can we just be normal? And of course, not all conservatives are like this. That's not what I'm trying to say. But when a story like this comes out, it's just like you are fulfilling the stereotype of what the left has of conservatives. That we are these gun-toting, crazy, dog-shooting, gay-hating, et cetera, individuals. And as I often talk about on Dennis and Julie, which, by the way, you should check out. Dennis and Julie's on Sundays on this channel at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. Timeless is live Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays at that same time. But as Dennis and I often talk about on Dennis and Julie, you don't want to fulfill the stereotype that the other side has of you. And especially right now, where I believe that conservatism is so important. We need to conserve the principles of the American founding. That is the way out of our crazy moment, especially in this moment right now. It is crucial that we conservatives, as Ben Shapiro often says, don't kick ourselves over and over in the nuts. Ben Shapiro, I love when he makes that observation. He goes, Republicans have a really fantastic ability to just kick themselves over and over in the nuts, like make things harder for themselves. So please, dear God, can we just be normal? So here's the backstory. And by the way, I see people are commenting in the chat. Let me know if you think I'm being too hard on Kristi Noem. I don't think I'm being too hard on Kristi Noem. I think this is kooky, but obviously so interested to know what you think. Yeah, people are writing, that's disgusting. Someone wrote, I've never seen someone tank their future political career faster. It's so true. So Kristi Noem's book is coming out tomorrow. It's called No Going Back, The Truth on What's Wrong with Politics and How We Move America Forward. Okay. Sounds like a good and important book. But then the governor of South Dakota, who is also in the running, it seems, or at least was in the running, to be Donald Trump's vice president, decided to share a detail about her life that really she should not have shared. And she wrote about how she shot her 14-month-old dog. Here are some passages from the book. It's so bad. Oh my God. She writes that she wanted to train this dog for hunting purposes. And then apparently this dog had very aggressive tendencies, wasn't being a good hunting dog, and actually went after some other livestock. So you have to understand, Kristi Noem lives in South Dakota. She goes hunting. I think she lives on or near a farm, or spends a lot of time on farms. But she's writing about how this dog was a crazy animal and how she decided just one day to shoot him. So she's talking about how one day this dog, Cricket, went after these chickens and started eating and killing these chickens. I can see Sean is starting to giggle. It's so bad for us to giggle, but it's so weird. So this dog is eating all these chickens. And then Kristi Noem writes that the dog, quote, whipped around to bite me. She goes on to talk about how the owners of the chickens who that dog Cricket went after started to weep. Noem said that she paid them, quote, for the price they asked. She wrote a check for them for her dog killing the chickens, and, quote, helped them dispose of the carcasses littering the scene of the crime. It's just a contest for how to make this more and more weird. Why are you sharing this? I hated that dog, Noem writes. And she talks about, again, how the dog was untrainable. The dog was dangerous, quote, to anyone she came in contact with. She was, quote, less than worthless as a hunting dog and had, quote, aggressive tendencies. And then Noem says, quote, I realized I had to put her down, and describes in the book putting the dog in like a hole and shooting the dog. Talk about kicking yourself over and over and over and over and over in the nuts, as Ben Shapiro says. In addition to this just being morally wrong, it is so beyond stupid to write about this in a book, to publicize this. And then, as if that is not enough, Kristi Noem in this book goes on to write about how she shot these goats who were also unruly. Just furthering the stereotype, right, that the other side would have of conservatives. She was basically like adopting the caricature of what people would think Republicans are. So yeah, she talks about shooting an unnamed goat. Apparently, it is a misdemeanor according to South Dakota law to shoot an animal. Makes sense. Kristi Noem has actually come back and said that South Dakota law protects those who attack and kill livestock. But whether or not she's going to be legally liable for this, it's just seems like her political career is now gone. And I mentioned Katie Britt. I got them a little bit confused. Thank you, Sean, for cutting in and clarifying. I got them a little confused, but she was actually, I think, subconsciously Katie Britt in my mind, because situations like this remind me of that State of the Union rebuttal. Remember a few months ago when Senator Katie Britt went on all of the news networks and she was giving the rebuttal to President Biden's disastrous State of the Union, and she was in a kitchen? Like, literally, she was sitting there in her kitchen, her home kitchen, that being the background. And she had this very Stepford wifey voice talking about the radical left and how we have to get back to our principles. And Joe Biden is ruining this country. And you're watching this going, oh my gosh, this is the easiest State of the Union rebuttal to have. President Biden got up there and he was lying. He was, slurring his words. He was getting angry at very random moments. He couldn't say Laken Riley's name correctly. He said Lincoln Riley. There were so many things that were just so easy for Senator Britt to respond to. But you had to put her in a kitchen, and you had to have I'm sorry to be this kind of harsh, but like Stepford wifey vibe. And I just want to say to conservatives, stop being the stereotype of what the left thinks we are. You're not helping yourselves, and you're certainly not helping the cause. What do you think, Sean? Too harsh?
There's a lot there to unpack. I feel like the left is very hard on conservative women. I didn't like the way they treated Sarah Palin. I think there's that whole push to believe all women on the left, but as soon as a conservative woman speaks and makes a mistake, they pounce on it. And I don't like that, so I have a knee-jerk reaction to the outrage over Kristi Noem shooting her dog. I don't know what it's like to live on a farm. I hear that's a normal practice to put animals down. And I don't want to judge that. It happened a long time ago. It's weird that it's in the book. I think it's even stranger how we tend to focus on things that really don't matter in this election. We spent so much time on things like that, or how Katie Britt was talking from her kitchen. In full disclosure, I didn't watch the whole thing. I saw clips of it, and I thought to myself, they really love jumping on a white conservative woman. They love it. And I have a natural disdain for that. So I want to defend Kristi Noem, I guess, that she made the right decision from a farm standpoint. You can't have a wild animal running around killing chickens, or
of course not.
God forbid, unruly goats. I don't know what it's like to live on a farm. I just hear that that's normal. And we today in the city are so detached from what it actually takes to have a chicken breast on your plate at night. We're very detached from that. So I don't want to judge.
Listen, I hear you.
I don't know what life's like in South Dakota.
I hear you.
Just think,
look, you raise a very good point, and this is really important. Yes, of course, the left is so hard on conservatives, and especially conservative women. It's absolutely true. And we've discussed this on Timeless. It was actually one of my favorite episodes because I sort of had this realization on the air where we were talking about why there is such a double standard. where if someone on the right does something kooky or immoral or wrong, there is such harsh scrutiny and attention. And people have been blowing up over this Kristi Noem shooting the dog thing. There's such scrutiny and attention to those on the right, especially to your point, Sean, with conservative women. But then on the left, comparatively, there's much less scrutiny and blow up. In fact, there seem to be sometimes no limits that the left can go to in terms of destruction and irrationality. We did that show where there was that incident in Long Island where 4 people killed 2 people. These 4 individuals chopped up those 2 deceased individuals' body parts and like dispersed them around Long Island. A child was walking to school and happened upon a severed arm. That's how all of this was discovered. And then, remarkably, those 4 murderers were let out on supervised release because they were not in the beginning charged with murder. They were charged with like dismembering and dispersing body parts, and that was not a cash bail eligible crime. So they were let out on supervised release because of these crazy cash bail policies. That should be getting full-blown, insane media attention, the same way that this Kristi Noem dog shooting thing is getting, insane, full-blown media attention. But it doesn't. And we on this show have talked about why that is. And the thing that we came up with is that when you're a conservative or when you're a religious person, it is very obvious what you stand for because you're staking your claim to something. You're saying, I'm a conservative. I want to conserve the principles of the American founding. Or I'm a Christian. I want to live my life, according to these values. And so when someone deviates from that, who's a conservative or a Christian, it's very starkly identified because it's very clear what those individuals say they believe. Whereas on the left, when someone is hypocritical or someone does something wrong, they have not in the same way put a stake to a worldview or certain principles. So they can just say, oh, I'm evolving, oh, I'm changing, et cetera, et cetera. So totally agree with you that there's a double standard with regard to the scrutiny. But nevertheless, it is so important right now that we conservatives present ourselves well and that we don't give people reasons to not vote Republican, And I'm not particularly enamored with the Republican Party. But right now, we really, really need conservatives and Republicans to lead this country away from the destruction that the Democrats have gotten us into. And I just want to say, with respect, we cannot give people these reasons to point to say, oh, conservatives are crazy, Republicans are crazy, we can't vote for them. It may not be fair, but it's the reality. All right.
I agree with you. It's weird that it's in the book. It's weird. I agree with you. She's probably shot her political career in the foot. No pun intended. I love dogs. There's a part of me that says, I don't care how crazy that dog is. Somebody could have fostered that dog and helped. But at the same time, can we please focus on what really matters?
Absolutely.
And not these little things that MSNBC decides are funny. And they're going to harp on it. Back with Palin, when the SNL picked it up, and all of a sudden people started to believe that Sarah Palin actually said she can see Russia from her house, which she never said.
Yep.
It's just funny to me. They really hold conservative
You're
women
right, they
to
do.
A standard like no other. And I've never really understood that.
You're right. Before we move on from this and talk about what things that actually matter, like the Antisemitism Awareness Act, I just want to say I do have a lot of respect for Senator Katie Britt. And up until this, I had a good amount of respect for Kristi Noem as the governor of South Dakota. I think what she did was morally questionable. As you say, Sean, we don't know the full details, but you get the overall point. And totally agreed, conservatives are judged way too harshly, but at the same time, we've got to be careful. It's just the situation that we're in now. We do have to be careful. All right. So let's talk about the Antisemitism Awareness Act, which, as I said, was passed in the U.S. House of Representatives last week on May 1st, and now it's going to a vote in the Senate. So the background of this is that this was introduced by a Republican Michael Lawler, who is a representative from the state of New York. And it had 61 co-sponsors, the majority of which were Republican, 46 Republicans, and then 15 Democrats. And it's described as a bipartisan bill. It was proposed by Republicans and overwhelmingly supported by Republicans, but a lot of Democrats did support it too. Just to quickly read the numbers here, 187 Republicans voted yes on this bill, 133 Democrats voted yes, 21 Republicans voted no, compared with 70 Democrats who voted no on the bill. So what does this bill do? And why is it important? Well, the bill essentially mandates that the Department of Education's Civil Rights Office enforce federal anti-discrimination laws using a definition of anti-Semitism that was outlined by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So, as much more background, we know that in the 60s, there was an onslaught of civil rights legislation in this country to overturn the terrible racist Jim Crow laws that existed in the South in this country. And many people, Christopher Caldwell is one such individual, Richard Hanania, who I interviewed on the show, who's wrote a fantastic book on this, is another individual. They have talked about how, although the civil rights law of the 60s was incredibly well-intentioned in some ways, it actually backfired in that it made a different kind of discrimination or a different kind of racism more mainstream, and it got the government involved in a place where the government ought not to have been involved. And then it kind of snowballed into this entire DEI complex that we're seeing today. And so the specific provision that this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act profiles is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Title VI prohibits, and I'm reading directly from the law, quote, prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. So if you're a college or university that gets federal funding, and nowadays almost every single college and university gets federal funding. It's not just that there are public universities like UC Berkeley and private universities like Harvard University. Now, a school like Harvard, and I'm reading here directly, gets $676 million roughly annually in federal funding. So this now applies to every single nearly school in the country. So this is saying that if you are a school that gets federal funding, you cannot discriminate on the basis of those three categories: race, color, and national origin. And so what this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is doing is it is essentially calling out the fact that Jews in this country have not been protected under that law. Because we see that if there are instances on colleges and universities where a Black student is discriminated against or claims to be discriminated against, or if there's a LGBTQ student who is discriminated against or claims to be discriminated against, there's, a lot of anti-discrimination enforcement, and schools will step in and immediately try to rectify that situation. But then over the past few months, we see, Jewish students being harassed, blocked from going to class. In recent weeks, we saw that a Jewish student was strangled, pepper sprayed at universities like UC Berkeley and UCLA. And then these schools are appearing to really do nothing about it. at least for now. We'll see what they do. So this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is trying to go, wait a minute, you have to equally apply anti-discrimination law to Jews. And it's mandating that the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights use this very, very specific definition of anti-Semitism that the International Holocaust Remembrance Association has outlined. So let's pause for a moment before I go on to that. I'm seeing that some pictures are being put up of a New York Times article. That's in a few minutes. I want to show that. I want to show the way that the New York Times has been kind of coming after certain Republicans for their opposition to the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. But let's look specifically here at what this definition of anti-Semitism is. So, according to the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, let's see if this definition is clear to you. It says that, quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So when you read that definition of anti-Semitism, I mean, it's not false. Of course, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. But let's think about this in terms of the law. And let's think about this in terms of anti-discrimination enforcement. So this act is trying to make the Department of Education beholden to this definition of anti-Semitism. So what would happen is that if someone fits this definition of anti-Semitism, then they can be charged with discrimination against Jews. And indeed, the federal government can actually have the jurisdiction to withhold federal funding to certain institutions that do not punish violators. And so when we read this definition, we may on a sort of individual basis agree with it. But with regard to the law, it's so broad. It's so broad. They say again, anti-Semitism is perception as well as hatred. They say that anti-Semitism is rhetorical as well as physical, that it's directed at Jews and non-Jews, and that it also is expressed or directed towards one's, quote, property, institutions, and religious facilities. So it's basically everything, right? So you can see where this is going, where it's very subjective. And as much as there is absolutely vicious, obvious expressions of anti-Semitism right now, there is no question about that. This does leave the door open for someone to be called anti-Semitic when they may not be, because this definition is so broad, applying to Jews and non-Jews, to property, to not property, etc. And so then they get more specific with this definition of anti-Semitism. And this is where we see a lot of opposition from the right and the left alike to going down this road of making this definition and these specific things constitute discrimination against Jews. So some of this is absolutely discrimination against Jews. For instance, one of the more specific definitions of this anti-Semitism is calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or extremist view of religion. Yeah, absolutely. But that, like, calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing, that's beyond the scope of discrimination. That violates, federal law to do that. But then there are these more specific things which get into some murky area, because although we may oppose people doing these things, although we may say that people who do these things are terrible, rotten individuals, it is murky if this should be deemed discrimination. Saying these things, that is, should be deemed discrimination. So let's look at specifics. claiming the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Is that in many ways a terrible thing to say? Yes. But should that really be deemed discrimination that students at these universities should be held liable for? I'm not so sure. Because then it opens the door for so many other things, you know? If you are saying that, if you are criminalized for saying that about Israel, then you basically can't criticize any other country. We have to allow people to speak. We have to allow people to speak and say terrible things that we may disagree with. Because but if we go down this road of policing speech and making a lot of speech, including terrible speech, constitute discrimination, then that will have the effect of making regular speech constitute discrimination. Because we know that we live in this subjective world where anything can be deemed your truth, my truth, etc. So we have to allow people to speak. That's one definition that would be deemed discrimination under this Antisemitism Awareness Act that would require the Department of Education to enforce anti-discrimination law against individuals who espouse those beliefs. That's one example. Another example is making dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews, or the power of Jews as a collective, especially but not exclusively the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. Yes, absolutely. Some people say those terrible things, and they are being anti-Semitic. I was just at Columbia, and there was some terrible, to put it mildly, guy standing out there with a huge sign in front of Columbia, and he was saying, Jews control the Democrat and Republican Party. They put the Jewish agenda first, and Jews want to bring, witchcraft and child sacrifice back to the United States. That guy is a vicious, terrible person. But he should be allowed to say that, as horrible as that is. Because as Dennis often says, and as that ACLU Jewish lawyer said who defended a Nazi, who represented a Nazi's right to march and to speak, once we start policing some terrible speech, then we are policing all speech. And also, again, as sort of difficult as this is to talk about, we have to acknowledge this. Some people may say something innocuous about Jews or Judaism. And because this definition is very broad, someone may be able to point to it and say that it is worse than it is, and it is constituting discrimination when it may not be. In my opposition to this, I want people to realize that in no way am I trying to endorse anti-Semitic speech. What I'm trying to say is we need to get away from the policing of speech. We need to punish behavior. If someone harasses a Jewish student, if someone lays a hand on a Jewish student, I am the law and order queen. You haul those people off, you arrest them, you expel them, you exact consequences. If someone is saying something terrible about Jews, you confront them. You have a moral obligation to stand up to those lies. But we can't go down this road of policing speech. We police actions, but we cannot police speech. And then finally, here's the most controversial, I guess, subset definition of anti-Semitism that this Antisemitism Awareness Act would require the Department of Education to deem discrimination. Quote, using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, for example, claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. So this is really controversial, obviously, because the blood libel and the whole idea of Jews being Christ killers has, of course, historically been one of the most evil things. And so many Jews have been slaughtered in the name of the blood libel, or in the name of being universally blamed for the death of Jesus Christ. But again, we've got to walk forward here with temperance and prudence and really, really looking at the specific of these things and not just having a knee-jerk emotional reaction to them, as terrible as they are. According to this act, claims of Jews killing Jesus would constitute anti-Semitism. And that's murky. Because although smearing Jews with one broad brush and saying Jews in their entirety are collectively responsible for, the death of Christ, although that is totally wrong and indeed anti-Semitic, saying that Jews were involved with the killing of Christ is the gospel. It just is. Now, the Romans crucified Jesus Christ. Pontius Pilate and Herod, ordered the crucifixion. But it is an undisputable fact that Jesus was a Jew and the disciples were Jews. Judas, who betrayed Christ, was a Jew. St. Peter, whose basilica I just went to a few weeks ago in the Vatican, he was a Jew who betrayed Christ 3 times. And so it is a part of the gospel that certain Jews were involved with outing Jesus to the Roman authorities, which led to his crucifixion. And again, that does not mean that Jews are collectively responsible for the killing of Christ. That is a terrible, terrible thing to say, and that is not true. But we don't live in a world where nuance is recognized. Smearing Jews with one broad brush and saying they're collectively responsible for killing Christ is very different than saying that certain Jews were involved with the handing over of Christ to the Roman authorities to be crucified. And this definition of anti-Semitism says claims of Jews killing Jesus would constitute anti-Semitism. So now let's go on to this New York Times article, because people are freaking out about this. And we've got to really look at the specifics here of what opponents to this are saying, and not just listen to narratives about what those opponents are saying. So here's the cover of the New York Times article. I know we put it up, so you've seen it before, but it is "Bill to Combat Anti-Semitism on Campuses Prompts Backlash from the Right." Okay, here's what's so funny about the New York Times. Yes, this bill on anti-Semitism has prompted backlash from the right, but it is mostly prompted backlash from the left. More Democrats voted against this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act than Republicans did. More Republicans supported this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act than Democrats did. But of course, the New York Times, because they know that Democrats are rightfully being, held to account right now for the many anti-Semites that are, in their base. The New York Times is profiling specifically, there are people on the right who are opposing this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. And the New York Times in this article is being dishonest because they're making it out to be that those on the right are opposing this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act for a different reason than they actually are. And it has to do with this claim of Jews killing Christ being deemed a definition of anti-Semitism. So again, here's the headline. And of course, the subline has to do with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Quoting, "Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican of Georgia, said the legislation could make it illegal to assert that Jews killed Jesus, punishing Christians for believing the gospel." So you see where this is going, right? You see that they're trying to make it out that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, they themselves believe that Jews are collectively responsible for killing Christ. And she's opposing this because she's a, Christian nationalist crazy person. That's the kind of narrative that the New York Times is trying to push. Let me pause. I see Sean is looking with some thoughts. Do you... What? You're looking at me with some... You're kind of looking skeptical.
No, I'm with you. My
Of course
least
they're doing
favorite
this.
phrase in the English language is "I'm offended." I hate it. I hate when people are there. There is no right in this country protecting you from being offended.
Yep.
It is quite the opposite of the freedom of speech, and it is precisely that we protect the speech you do not want to hear
Yes.
that makes that right so important. So if we start making laws based upon the fact that someone's offended, we're in a dangerous place.
And again, this is a really hard thing because we are seeing right now, and this is something I want to make so clear. We are seeing right now an explosion of anti-Semitism. And we have to do something about that. We have to acknowledge that, we have to face that for what it is, and we have to do something about that. But this does not appear to be the road that we want to go down because it's not going to have the intended outcome. And it's just going to support this DEI, group protections, policing speech complex, which is in large part what got us into this arena in the first place. But yes, I agree with you about the whole offended thing. So, okay, back to the New York Times. They have this headline. They're focusing on what Marjorie Taylor Greene said, and they're calling her and others who oppose this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, they're calling them, quote, far right. So let's look at picture 2 here of the New York Times article. Quote, a bipartisan push in Congress to enact a law cracking down on anti-Semitic speech on college campuses has prompted a backlash from far-right lawmakers and activists who argue that it could outlaw Christian biblical teachings. Okay, let's pause right there because the New York Times is being dishonest in a lot of ways. First of all, they're being dishonest by omission because it is not just, quote, far-right lawmakers who are opposing this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. As I said, more Democrats than Republicans are opposing this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that many of these individuals who are opposing this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act are not saying that it would, quote, outlaw Christian biblical teachings. They're saying that it would make certain Christian biblical teachings be called discrimination against Jews, and that is absolutely true. They're not saying that it would outlaw, like, generally Christian biblical teachings. And so it's just the New York Times trying to make these opponents to the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act seem more dramatic than the evidence indicates that their opposition actually is. So let's look at what Marjorie Taylor Greene actually said, okay? And this is also reading from the New York Times. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said she opposed the bill because, quote, it could convict Christians of anti-Semitism for believing the gospel that says Jesus was handed over to Herod to be crucified by the Jews. You can love Marjorie Taylor Greene. You can hate Marjorie Taylor Greene. You can think she's a nutbag. You can think that she's great. Putting any opinions you have of her aside, that is true. Now, the word she used there, convict, I would not have used that word because it makes it seem like someone, in like a court of law would be convicted. Again, what this would be is that a person would be deemed to say something discriminatory against Jews if they said this. So I wouldn't have used that term convict. But she is right that this definition of anti-Semitism says that, quote, claims of Jews killing Jesus would constitute anti-Semitism. And she's right by flagging, wait a minute, this would make the gospel discrimination. That's just true. And I don't think that makes her far right. I think that makes her someone who is looking at this objectively and opposing it. So then the New York Times goes on and talks about how, the assertion that Jews killing Jesus has been this cudgel used against Jews for generations to smear them. And that's absolutely true again. But you see what the New York Times is trying to do. They're trying to go, look, Marjorie Taylor Greene said this. The blood libel has been used against Jews for so long. And I'm going to give another quote of other politicians who oppose this to kind of link them with those who have used the blood libel. And that is just not fair. That is not fair. So let's look at one other quote just to prove the dishonesty of the New York Times about this. So the New York Times references Matt Gaetz, right? And again, they're not overtly saying that Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene are abiding by the blood libel, but they are, trying to make a link here. Let's look at what Matt Gaetz actually said, because he is being accused of pushing the blood libel, or for at least condoning the blood libel, or the idea that Jews, generally are responsible for the killing of Jesus. Let's look at Matt Gaetz' tweet opposing the Antisemitism Awareness Act. Again, he just references a part of it where he says claims of Jews killing Jesus would constitute anti-Semitism and discrimination under this act. And he says, quote, "The gospel itself would meet the definition of anti-Semitism under the terms of this bill." And again, he's right. And then here's the final part of the New York Times article, which I just find to be funny. They quote a Democratic politician who says, quote, "How dare the party of Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene come down here and lecture Democrats about anti-Semitism. Representative Teresa Ledger Fernandez, Democrat of New Mexico, who voted against it, said on the House floor." So it's like, here we have a Democrat who voted against it. And then the article ends by going, "In addition to Mr. Gaetz and Ms. Greene, hard right opponents of the legislation include da-da-da-da-da-da-da." So it just shows you they're focusing on all of the, right-wing politicians who voted against it and sort of putting a microscope on them. Like, oh, well, they're voting against it because they're these, Christian nationalists who don't want, this definition to be deemed anti-Semitic, but then they're overlooking the other individuals who oppose this measure. And it just shows you, in my view, again, the unequal treatment by the New York Times. Sean, you probably don't want to touch it. Remember last week, and I asked if you had any thoughts after we were talking about abortion and Donald Trump, and I was like, totally get if you don't want to touch it, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, about Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene opposing this for that specific measure, that definition of Jews being involved, or with the killing of Jesus.
Well, I feel like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz sometimes make it easy for the left.
They certainly do.
But not in this case. They seem to be dead on. And I don't know quite how I feel about that, because I'm not a big supporter of either of them, but there have been times when they are dead on, and this seems to be one of them.
Yeah.
So I'll take it.
Yep, it's true.
Yeah.
So, but just on a final note on this subject, again, what we need to do is, in my view, we have to get away from anti-discrimination law. Perhaps it was passed for good intentions. I think it was in large case in the 60s. But what it has done is it has really had the effect of policing speech, of making this, according to the Washington Post, $9 billion DEI industry with, anti-racism people on college campuses and DEI directors and this like massive bloated bureaucracy. And when we make these definitions so kind of broad and vague, what we're actually doing is we're not allowing real discrimination to be punished, because then a lot of things can be deemed discrimination. A Muslim student can say that they have a claim to discrimination under this. A Jewish student can say it. A Christian student can say it. Like, everybody in this broad definition, my truth, your truth world can say that they've been discriminated against. We need a universal colorblind system that allows speech, including despicable speech, and absolutely and vigorously punishes action and conduct. That's at least how I see it. All right, before we end very heavy subject. So let's talk about something lighter, which is MyPillow. As many of you know, I use a lot of MyPillow products, including the My Slippers. I sleep on a MyPillow. I sleep on the Giza Dream bed sheets, and I use my towels. And you can get a lot of these products at a massive discount right now. They're having a $25 extravaganza. You can get 2-pack multi-use MyPillows for $25, MyPillow sandals for $25, 6-pack towel sets, for $25, 4-pack dish towels for $25, and for the first time, the premium MyPillows with all new Giza fabric for just $25. Orders are over $75 will receive free shipping if you go to mypillow.com and use the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745 today and use the promo code Hartman. Yeah, some people are writing, so some organization gets to decide what Americans can and can't say about a foreign state and its government? Insane. It's all right. It's the road we're going down. People are writing nonsense. Oh, someone is writing good evening from South Africa. Wow, that is so cool. Thank you so much for tuning in from South Africa. And thanks to all of you for your comments about this. So ending on something totally different for just a few moments than all of the politics stuff. Those of you who know Timeless, been listening to the show, know that I like to drop in non-political things as well as political things. I have been trying to test out certain changes in thinking. A few weeks ago, as many of you know, I did this show, which many people seem to really like, on your gut, your intuition, catching and flipping negative thoughts, projection. And people really took to that and wrote into me and said that they enjoyed hearing those suggestions. I'm trying to take them myself. I don't claim to be an expert on any of this stuff, but a very wise individual was telling me about it, and I was very intrigued. So if you haven't checked that out, please do go back and watch those episodes. But I've recently been trying this kind of new thought experiment that I want to tell you about. We hear all the time these no trends. No sugar, for instance. Here in Los Angeles, that's a big thing. All my friends, so many people I know, I'm like, I'm cutting sugar for this month, or no bread, or no carbs, or no drinking, for instance, is another big one. Here's something I'm trying, and this is a different no than we've ever heard. No complaining. Have you ever heard of that trend? The answer is probably no, because I don't really think it's a big trend. But I was thinking the other day about all these no fads. We did no contact the other day on this show. There are all of these no fads. But the one that you don't ever hear about is no complaining. And think about how much time all of us spend in a day complaining. Now, some people may think or may cut in and go, well, isn't what you just did, talking about the Antisemitism Awareness Act, complaining? No, I don't think that would constitute complaining. I think that's analyzing something that is going on in our country and saying why I think it is misguided. That's not what I'm talking about with regard to complaining. You can lament, a certain law. You can lament the direction our country is heading in. You can lament a lot of things. But think about how often throughout the day we mentally or aloud, not just in our head, complain. On Dennis and Julie recently, I was talking about how I was in the left turning lane and there was somebody in front of me who was turning into a Whole Foods parking lot, and then way above at the stoplight was the left lane. And this guy was taking forever to turn into the Whole Foods parking lot, and I was behind him in the car, and I was watching all these other cars zoom ahead of me, go in the left turning lane that I wanted to be up at the light at, and turning. And I was sitting there and I was so damn angry. I was like, this Whole Foods guy, screw him. He's delaying my return to my apartment by 3 minutes. I was sitting there complaining. And then I sat there and I thought, you know what, Julie, this is so ridiculous. May this be your worst problem in life. that you are delayed 3 minutes returning to your apartment because some Whole Foods guy is taking too long to turn. But just all throughout our day, whether it's in the car or whether it's at work or with any kind of minor inconvenience, we complain. And it takes up so much of our mental energy. And I think it really just kind of like corrodes us, maybe not in a huge way, but in a more subtle way, which builds up and amounts to something huge. So I just encourage you to consider that as I'm considering it myself and testing these kinds of thought experiments to elevate and improve my life. Instead of cutting sugar, cut the complaining. And see how in just a few days, you probably have more energy and you're just a lot happier and more grateful. Because a lot of the stuff that we complain about, honestly, really isn't worth it and really isn't that bad. Amen, Sean?
Yeah, amen. If I have a bigger problem with sugar than I do with complaining. Your monologue there makes me think of two things. One that ties in with the anti-Semitism. I heard a great quote from Thomas Sowell, who was asked by a Jew somewhere, how can Jews mitigate the hate that they experience in the world? And Thomas Sowell told him, stop being successful. Because when you're successful, people are going to hate you. Precisely because when someone is successful, you have a choice, right? You can either internalize that and look at yourself and ask yourself what you're not doing to be successful, or you can hate the successful one. So that reminds me, which brings me to something Larry Elder always says, that his father used to tell him, after any experience that doesn't go your way, look in the mirror and ask yourself, what could I have done differently to change the outcome? So rather than hating someone else, hate yourself. And that'll stop the complaining. I know it sounds crazy, but
no, it's
if more
so true.
People internalized rather than pointing the finger and blaming other people, it would be a better world.
It's so true. Yeah. I love it. Ending on this note, "Hate Yourself" by Sean McConnell. No, but it's really, really true. And you guys know, I get on some of these like fascination obsessions. I go through these phases of flags. I did that whole show on flags, reading this whole book on the flags and symbols on flags in the world. I did shows on Islam. I got really fascinated by religion for some time. I was looking back. I've done shows on, remember the cemeteries show and the burial practices show? That was one of my favorites. Weddings was another one. Right now, I'm kind of in this phase of fascination with thought experiments. Because as I said with the gut episode, and I love that someone's commenting, I liked the show on the gut. I like that you liked the show on the gut. As I said in that episode, your mind is really all that you have. It is. You can be so, rich. You can be so successful. You can have everything in life going for you. But if your mind's not in a good place, it will mean nothing. And then conversely, you can have a very difficult situation in life. But if you've got a sturdy brain, you got a sturdy worldview, you're rich. You're good. And so I am really in this, like trying to find out these thought experiments and going with them and trying to just become the best kind of person I can be and share some of that. So we're trying that. So I'm going to go home and eat a lot of sugar, but I'm not going to complain about any of it and the fat that undoubtedly I will add to myself. Someone's writing, for your thought obsession, listen on Audible, The Power by Rhonda Byrne. Oh, thank you so much for that recommendation. And again, to close out, a reminder, I'm reading The Defining Decade. I'd love for you to read parts of it too. We can discuss it together, how to navigate your 20s and life in general. Thank you so much for being here. As a reminder, Timeless is Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern, live right here on YouTube. I also take snippets of the show after and make them into Julie noted shorter clips. So please do check those out. And as always, you can email me at julie@julie-hartman.com. Take care, everyone. Good to be home, and I'll see you soon.